So I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I promised Walter, since he does this more than I do, that he can interrupt me.
So I was at the NOAC, trying to swim laps, and I'm thinking of all the questions I'm going to ask Dean. And then I got this great question about growing up and going to St. Aug, and he's going to Jesuit. And then I realized, I'm not the moderator. And so you get to take charge.
So let me start. So this is an odd moment for cities. On the one hand, every study shows that an increasing number of people will live in cities, and that cities are going to get larger around the world. On the other hand, some would argue that the present political divide has pushed cities out of power in America. Do you buy that, first off? And so what?
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Anyway, welcome to New Orleans, the greatest city in the world. Who dat? Saints are going to win the Super Bowl. Sorry, the rest of y'all. Actually, I reject that premise.
Okay.
For a number of different reasons. One, the natural tendency, especially national media, who's covering the White House and Congress, is to say, look how divided everything is, and everybody is. We are clearly divided by President Trump. There's a love side, there's a hate side. But the country's not divided about President Bush, 41 who passed. You've seen a unity in the last 6 days where people are hearkening back to a time when people worked together and a real yearning to do that. But functionally on the ground in America every day, you see this in airports, you'll see it in the great city of New Orleans. People of different race, creeds, colors, religions, sexual orientations, urban and rural origins are working together every day. And New Orleans is a perfect example of that. This city has not only a visceral, but an incredible connection to our rural brothers and sisters in this state. And we have a symbiotic relationship. Every piece of food that you're eating, if it's from New Orleans or anywhere around here, either came from the fields in Louisiana. Emerald, you know this. Everything that happens on Emerald's table comes from the folks in rural Louisiana or the fishermen on the coast. And the jobs that are provided in the city actually then go back to the state budget and feed the rest of the state. So in a functional way, rural and urban America are working together very well every day, and they're going to have to continue to do so.
But their leaders aren't.
Well, that's not necessarily true either. On a federal level, you see congressmen not talking to each other. You don't really see that in cities. I had the pleasure of being the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. It's a bipartisan organization. Democrat and Republican mayors work together all the time because we're not ideologically bent. And the reason we can't be is because when you make a decision in a city like New Orleans, the next day, when you're at the grocery store getting milk for your kids or cereal, or you're at the laundry, somebody's in your face, like the next day. And you can't explain to them that theoretically or ideologically, they're like, yeah, I hear that, but theoretically, ideologically, I'm going to kill you unless you fix the problem. And so as a consequence, mayors get to be fixers of problems in very constructive ways because we have to.
So I'm gonna force both of you separately just to take off your pro-New Orleans hat for a second.
It's impossible.
A hat, a hat I've worn on occasion too. After Katrina, and I know the city has made a dramatic comeback, but let me ask a challenging question. It was the site of this huge tragedy. It was also seen as this place of such great potential for experimentation. I remember talking to an educational philanthropist in California who said, oh my God, we can go remake a school system. What are the things that New Orleans failed to do? What are the things, I can see the evidence of the things it did. What did New Orleans fail to do after Katrina? What were the lost opportunities?
Well, I think it's an unfair question. And the reason is this. No, I'll tell you. First of all, there's no way that in 8 years you could fix 300 years of problems. There's even a good time when nothing happened. When a city was completely destroyed, 500,000 homes across the Gulf Coast were hurt, 250,000 destroyed, 1,800 people gone, everything in this city underwater. What's happened here in the last 8 years has been miraculous, whether you're a booster of the city or not. So it is, as the mayor of the city said, there are only so many hours in the day and so many dollars, and given what we had to do, we did really great. But having said that, it's obviously true that we haven't solved all of our problems. And, you know, when you think about historically, the things that went wrong, they were the things that we've tried to fix post-Katrina, because the miraculous thing that happened in this city is the people allowed me as the mayor to challenge them about not putting the city back the way it was. So you heard me say a bunch of times when I was mayor, we're going to build it the way it should have been if we would have gotten it right the first time. So what did we miss? City was too corrupt in a state that was too corrupt. We let education get away from us, where our kids were being educated in awful buildings and they weren't learning very much. Crime and the murder rate had been out of control for a long time, although it came down and it continues to go down. It's still way too high. Income inequality continues to plague us, and we have problems that are not just of our own making, although we have contributed to it, but a much larger thing. And so now the city, if it's going to succeed, like all great cities, Detroit will survive. Chicago, which was in a bad place in the 60s, has come back. You need a good couple of generations of really good, solid leadership. City's got a very, very long way to go. It really is in great shape. It's still one of the great cities of the world. But from an infrastructure perspective, we're in a really bad situation. And then finally, on the climate change issue, which is really the most existential threat that we face, if we don't fix that problem, no matter what you build in the city, is going to continue to be a substantial threat. And I don't know of a place that's more at risk than the city of New Orleans, given where we have triple threats, most of which are from climate change, but some of which is from subsidence.
Your turn. The grandest things that New Orleans didn't do.
The philanthropist on education reform, I assume, was Eli Broad, right?
Yep.
And Norm Pearlstein's here, he knows him well. And what we tried to do on education reform is say, you don't want to just rebuild the bad old school system. And so what happened was we created a system that not only is 100% charter, but 100% choice, which means every parent gets to do a common app. And this was your sister, but I'll give you a little credit too. But it was Kathleen Blanco gets a lot of credit, and Patrick Dobart, a lot of people said we're going to create a new type of school system with Eli Broad and Teach for America funding. A few blocks from here, right after the storm, about 2 weeks after, I was on the board of Teach for America, and we had all 250 Teach for America core members who were here and said, you know, we don't have a school system. You can either go to Houston and get a job, or we'll try to give you a bit of stipend if you'll help rebuild it here. Out of those 250 core members, 250 stayed in New Orleans, including our friend Ramsey Green, who is now in charge of infrastructure of this city. What happened is we created a system with parental choice, so you get a common app and you get to pick your school, and competing charter schools that try to compete for the students. What we failed to do is know how complicated that was. For example, we tried to make sure that the charters couldn't skim the cream. That was easier to do when 100% of the kids are going to charter schools. But it meant we also had to say you can't expel kids, you can't suspend kids. So it took a long time. There are many other things you could talk about, you know, sewage and water board, justice, criminal justice, everything else. But to me, the basic thing you got to get right is the schools. And that's still a continuing education process for us.
I'll add to that. I think generally we took a school system that wasn't working and we have one that is working a lot better. Graduation rates are up, dropout rates are down. Achievement gap between our kids that they said couldn't learn and the kids outside of the city has closed. But there are a couple of holes in this model. One was dealing with kids that needed more help. One was, with Walter said, with not really getting clear about what kids can stay and what kids can go in suspensions. The other was the displacement of a lot of teachers. So I love Teach for America. My daughter did it, and I think it's a great thing. However, you have to create a sustainable teaching force that knows the kids, and that's really important too. So this system is going to have some challenges, and we don't want people to take the New Orleans model and try to replicate it all over the country, because it's not, if, for instance, you couldn't pick this up and put it in New York as a whole system. It can be used, and it's not so much charter versus normal public versus voucher or private. As Walter said, I mean, generally if you let the principal be the quarterback, hire and fire really good teachers, and not have school board members saying you have to hire my brother and sister, not having fights about who's going to get the toilet paper contract, but be focused on educating the kids. And you have some measure of really good accountability, not just teaching to the test, and some level of adult involvement in the child's life, you're going to find a better product. If you have a school that's got those kind of qualities, it's generally going to be a little bit better than the one that went before.
And you have to empower the school leader.
Correct.
You have to give parents choice. But as you said, here's something we didn't get, meaning me. I was chair of the board of Teach for America. And I thought, okay, all these eager young Ramsey Greens coming to Andy Copland, who I think I just saw him, maybe
Right there.
he's hiding, you know, was ED of Teach for America down and was on Louisiana Recovery Authority with me. It was really great, but there's something else that teachers do besides just teach, which is be an anchor of a community. They live there, they're from there. And so we all have to have a humility to keep learning.
I think that's right.
What would you say, and these must have been hard conversations, even if neither one of you actually had to have them, what would you say to the teachers who were displaced when the school system essentially got completely overhauled? Because there were a lot.
Yeah, it was 6,000.
And they were, just for the people who don't know the system, there was a portion of them was sort of the bedrock, sort of working class.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
They were the
Belonged.
people in the community.
So
we're saying you don't have jobs.
So talk about what that was like and what that meant for the
Let me go back and remind everybody what happened. Katrina wiped out everything. Neither the city nor the school board had any money to pay anybody anything. And all city employees, all school board employees, everybody got fired. Everybody. There wasn't anything here, which goes to a much more difficult conversation about how the Stafford Act works and whether or not the country is ready to respond to catastrophic losses like maybe you guys saw up in Sandy, other folks saw in Florida. You see Puerto Rico having a hard time really just getting back on their feet. And so I find in retrospect that was a blind spot for everybody. Remember, everybody was just trying to stay alive. Everybody was moving back quickly. And actually, the first thing that everybody needed, although you didn't know where your doctor was, your hospital was, your house was out, was getting schools back. So getting them back fast was important too. And I think everybody was going a little bit faster than they should have been, notwithstanding the fact that you couldn't get all of those teachers back. I think what we've come to learn now, given how even great the TFA kids are, that if you don't have the anchors in the community and the cultural connection to the kids, and a communion and a marriage between them, your system long-term is not going to be sustained. And, you know, it was an unfortunate consequence of Katrina, like so many other people suffered. And I think we could have done a better job at that.
I don't fully agree because I think there was a balance you had to have from the old teachers versus new people coming in. But I think
you needed both.
You're arguing for more of the older teachers? Or?
No, I'm arguing that the reform of the school system was a damn good thing for this city.
It was. No, it was. It's a much, much better. Anybody who remembers what it was like before, and if you're thinking about the kid, it is a far superior to what we had before. The question now is, how do you get it better, and how far is it from perfect?
Yeah.
It's probably a C system right now. It went from being an F system. We had a lot of schools that were failing. Now we have, I don't know, a couple. Andy knows the specific answer to this. But all the metrics that are objective that you look at it, it's far better than it was before. A lot of our kids are now going to college. The numbers of scholarships that they have is much better. But it's far from perfect, and we have a lot of work to do. It just takes years to build.
But every metric is better, including graduation rates and scores.
So let me shift to another hard one. I'll get to easy ones before we
Yeah.
So a month ago, I was in San Juan because I wanted to see the aftermath of the storm. So I drove through the coastal areas that were the most devastated. And my first thought was, this stuff is so fragile. I'm not sure that, I don't know the place. I'm not sure they should rebuild here. I've also,
you get to take this one.
I've also had the experience of driving around after Sandy and thinking, boy, if everything in all the climate reports that I've read come true, I'm not sure they should rebuild in all these places. And I'm sure that there were debates here. I
don't think they should have rebuilt Wall Street after Sandy.
Yeah, Wall Street is totally toast. But they built a whole World Trade Center back. Why would you do that?
You want me to? I'll take.
It's
a serious question.
Are there places? Are there places? And I'm not just talking about New Orleans. I'm talking about these fragile cities. I've spent 6 years in California. There are places where the wildfires are that people once didn't live.
So we asked the Dalai Lama when he was here what advice he had for us, and he said, "Well, if you live low and it's wet, go high." Sounded like good urban planning to me. But
He lives in Tibet. You go up in the Himalayas.
It was a
The Dalai Lama is coming on at a later panel.
The highest mountain we have is Monkey Hill.
So this is obviously an incredibly sensitive subject. And some of it is, and I tease my friends from New York because everybody from New York didn't think exactly like the Speaker of the House, which is the reason why we got hit, was because we're soulless people who hang out on Bourbon Street drinking too much, eating too much of Emerald's food, and that God was visiting on us a terrible tragedy because of the way we live.
Pelosi.
Right. No, this was Hastert.
Oh, Hastert.
Hastert.
Yeah, I don't think John Boehner would have said
No, but Denny Hastert said they shouldn't live there. So when you tell people that, I mean, they get protective about it. And the truth of the matter is that New Orleans is not as vulnerable as Miami or New York. And so when people start talking that, they say, well, who's, pin the tail on the donkey, who needs to move? Now, from an objective...
I'm not asking about not rebuilding New Orleans. I'm asking about the hard debates that must have taken place. Do you rebuild all of New Orleans East?
Correct.
Do you rebuild, the parts of San Juan I drove through that are going to get whacked in the next storm?
Yes, there are some... The Rockefeller Foundation is working on something called 100 Resilient Cities. And I've been working with them for a long time as mayor and Walter is I think, on the board of Rockefeller. And the idea is that we're going to get hit by a lot of stuff. On the west, you're going to continue to get wildfires, you're going to get earthquakes. In the heartland, you're going to get tornadoes. On the east side, you're going to get hurricanes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what you have to do, because you can't move everybody, 85% of the people in this country live in and around what we would call, quote unquote, vulnerable areas. So you start thinking about the ability to actually pick up and move, and you think twice and say, you know what, we may have to make sure that we build back stronger and better. Social cohesion, stronger and bigger things that are going to withstand what we have coming our way and be prepared for them. Now, there are some places, and I tell people this all the time, and you got to really pay attention to this, the folks that are from New Orleans. I won't speak about where the rest of you live. But if climate change continues to do what it does, the sea level continues to rise, if the land continues to shrink, in 30 or 40 years, New Orleans is going to be an island that's protected by this $14.6 billion levee barrier that we have. And everything south of I-10 is going to be compromised. And if you back up a little bit and don't get too afraid, and within 100 years, the parallel where Austin and Atlanta are going to be the southern part of the country. Mm-hmm. So that requires you to do a lot of thinking about a lot of things. On prevention, really hard decisions about where people can live, where to put massive infrastructure investments, and the country's really not having an honest discussion about that.
Are there places where, just to be very direct, and for both of you, are there places in America, in New Orleans, in California, in Puerto Rico, where people just should not live anymore?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a story.
And I don't mean entire cities, but...
Well, let me tell you a story. So I'm on the Louisiana Recovery Authority. Andy's our executive director. And we want rebuilding in parts of New Orleans East. The levees hadn't been built on the industrial canal below sea level. And there were a lot of protesters that came in, mainly actually sort of acorn types who were saying, right to rebuild, right to return. And we were saying, no. You don't want to go back to that low-lying area in the east. And I was about to say something at one of the meetings, because it got kind of racial, as you would know, because Lower Nine was an African-American 1950s homeowner, good community. And Donna Brazil was seated next to me. She was my seatmate, I think. She grabbed me by the knee and said, let me handle this. I said, thank you. And she says to some of these acorn people, excuse my language, you want to send your white Trotskyite-ass people back to Lower Nine, you can do it, but don't send my family back there. Wait till you get the levees built before you send it back. And so it was a real struggle of which parts of Lower Nine should be rebuilt. They had a system, it was the city one more than the state, where they green-dotted neighborhoods.
My Our neighborhood.
Yeah. So he and I grew up within a block and a half of each other on Prior and Napoleon.
I'm getting a signal that Mitch has to...
To the extent that we grew up.
Yeah, right. But all of a sudden, I'm in favor of don't send people back to these places. My dad calls me at 6 a.m. He says, what have you done? I said, what are you talking about? He said, they put a green dot on Broadmoor. So tell me what happened.
Right. everybody went insane. And, you know, Broadmoor came back and is now one of the more vibrant areas. And I'll end with this, and I'm going to have to get out of here because I got to catch a plane. But
you're going to answer the question about whether
yeah.
you're going to run for president before you leave, right?
No.
You're not going to?
I'll answer mine. I'm not going to.
I'll answer it quickly. But on this issue, yes, the country has to think about these things. But when you have that conversation, you have to be fair, and you have to do it with objective data and make sure that indigenous populations and poor people are not taken more advantage of. For example, you could make the argument, I'm not making the argument, that places that get hit repetitive times should be looked at. And the people of New Orleans get really defensive about this because the truth of the matter is that we're just like number 10 on the most vulnerable list, but people are the ones that keep saying that we have to go away. So I guess it's kind of like making sure that if you have this conversation, it's around science, it's around thought, and it's not just, you can't just pick up people and say, why don't you just go someplace else? The world just doesn't work that way. However, we have to have serious conversations going forward. And then in the meantime, while you're thinking about it, you have to protect yourself by making yourself stronger and more resilient. And that's about physical infrastructure, it's about political infrastructure, it's about being able to not only be prepared for what's coming your way, but be able to rescue, recover, rebuild, and then continue to think through it. And then learning from past examples. So for example, when Rita hit, we had to evacuate a lot of hospitals and nursing homes because they didn't have an evacuation plan, because they lost their electricity, because all their electrical stuff was in the basement. Now, when Sandy hit New York, you will remember that a lot of hospitals and them had to do the same exact thing, and it was many, many, many years later. So the country has to get better at preparing for the disasters that are going to continue to come our way. The answer to your other question is probably not, but if I change my mind, you're going to be the first one to know. I'll call you.
That's good to hear.
All right, I got to go. Thank y'all.
Take care.
See you.
Be good, buddy.
Take care. Welcome.
While the mayor is leaving, let me say.
Walter's going to run.
No. Let me say a couple things about Mitch Landrieu. He inherited a city that was so financially messed up, the infrastructure is messed up. He got the budget right, he got the police right, he got the schools right. And what we need in this country are people who just know how to solve problems the way mayors do. And I know his dad would get mad at me for saying this. Dean and I covered his dad. But Mitch is the best mayor we've had, you know, probably in the history of New Orleans.
So can we use our time and I can ask you 2 questions?
No, I get to ask you a couple questions,
Well,
like when you're coming home.
So what's it, talk a little bit about coming home. So,
you know, there's a
lived...
boomerang effect in this country. And you were talking about cities, and you were talking about national politics. So Kathy, my wife, and I, you know, we lived in New York, Washington, Aspen, and we had the, you know, nice different places to live in. But at a certain point, you felt an unraveling in this country. An unraveling where people weren't civil to each other, where we couldn't try to solve problems. We just turned every problem into something that could be a weapon, you know, on a cable TV show. And I began to think, maybe it's time for some of us to go home. You and I both left New Orleans around the same time. We both had the opportunity to be on the coast, you know, New York, Los Angeles, Washington. And at a certain point, you realize that in cities, where there are real communities, that's how we're going to regenerate American pragmatism and civility. Kathy and I came back home. Kathy joined the Greater New Orleans Foundation. You know, I'm involved, joined the City Planning Commission. When you do things with real communities of people you trust, you can restore a fabric that has been frayed at the national level. So please come home.
So let me ask you a provocative Mitch Landrieu question. He is, by his own description, I think he uses the phrase, a radical centrist. Do you think whether it's him or somebody else, could this country actually elect an extremely centrist Democrat or Republican? Could this country? When I look at there literally are 37 possible candidates for president, and I don't think there's more than 1 or 2 who could be actually characterized as a centrist the way Mitch Landrieu or Jerry Brown could be.
Correct. The cycles of American history identified by Arthur Schlesinger Sr. and then his son Arthur Schlesinger Jr. say that we always swing back in 20-year cycles. And the swing back now is not liberal versus conservative, but it's a swing back from the polarization, where we each become very tribal in our tents, to a hunger, not just for centrism, but for the ability to work together. If you wanted a demonstration of what that was, it was H.W.'s funeral yesterday. The reasons it's systemically hard is because of our old profession, or my old profession, which is that the media has become polarized as well. Not the New York Times, but cable TV, cable TV and talk radio by
Fox News.
By the very technology of it.
Right.
When I once worked at Time Magazine, I once worked at CNN, we had to get a broad audience to be successful. But then the digital age and cable and talk radio said if you get 6% of the audience that's really deeply loyal to you, you win in a 500-channel environment. And so cable TV and talk radio and blogs and Twitter feeds became deeply polarized. We have to overcome that because we are a centrist nation. Everybody in this room, we could get 80% agreement among 80% of you on everything. Comprehensive immigration reform, you name it. But our politics and our media pull us to the extremes.
So we have maybe one or two questions. We have literally 30 seconds left.
I'm happy to stay. Emerald is cooking. He'll...
Question? Yes.
About education. I political science major at Tulane. I now work for
Roll wave.
yes. I now work for Chef Emerald Marketing, but education is what education is sort of what brought me to my interest in politics. My question is about the charter schools, and after Katrina, how do you balance a charter school by nature being a privately owned business or like a business, and how do you ensure you use checks and balances in that environment to make sure that the collective good is sort of taken care of?
Okay, let me push back very hard on your premise. Every charter management organization here is not a private business. They're all nonprofits that raise philanthropic dollars, whether it's KIPP or Collegiate or every other one. These are very dedicated people, including your friend Eli Broad and others, who are taking money. And this notion that we're privatizing the schools and making it corporate really rankles me a bit, because these are people who are donating and not making money off of it. Now, the way you solve your problem is you actually trust kids and their parents to know what school they want to go to. You give them choice. I grew up in the heart of this city. My parents had choice. I was pretty privileged. Your parents, in some ways, had choice. You got to St. Augustine. You know, it wasn't like you had to go to the neighborhood school. Every parent should have the same choice. When parents and kids have choices, that's the best form of accountability. And in the 0 seconds we have remaining, I get to turn the table because
I think it's actually 0 seconds.
Yeah, I know, but you're going to have to talk a little bit.
Okay.
Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. That's why we tried to create a school system in which, with the Common App here, you get to pick 3 schools and you're going to get into one of them. And they're competing schools around town. Our old neighbor of Broadmoor has the Wilson School, the Green School, and Lusher. You get a choice, and if a school doesn't get enough people choosing it, it's what? What decision? If a school... But suppose you live where I do, Broadmoor, sort of near where he did, where Mitch lived. You got 3 or 4 choices, or you can actually pick a school out of the neighborhood and just deal with the transportation. If a school does not get enough kids choosing it, the money follows the student. So the school has to shut down. He talked, and Ramsey Green was talking about, Andy will remember it well, the Wilson School in my own neighborhood. My brother was on the charter board. Suddenly, it was a failing school and people weren't choosing it. So they decided to yank it and give the building to somebody else to try. My brother called me up and said, hey, can you save our charter? I said, no, I'm not going to interfere. Y'all screwed it up. Parents were not choosing that school, and so somebody else got to come in. It's like when a Whole Foods moves into a Safeway and one has a good salad and another doesn't, people choose it, and what we don't have in public education is the right of most people to choose their school. Only people like you and me, and to some extent the Baquet family, get to say, I ain't gonna send you to the McDonough school, I'll send you to St. Aug, or I'll get to send you to school. We gotta have more competition. But let me go to Dean, if you don't mind, because I'm not all that interesting on this. You're from here. Your great-great-great-grandfather was a wonderful clarinetist, and then, of course, George Baquet, your granduncle, played with Louis Armstrong, Sheila Baquet. You come from 5 generations of New Orleanians, run restaurants. You have to decide in 4 or 5 years, assuming the New York Times doesn't change its retirement policy. Where is your heart?
Putting me on the spot.
What is your feeling about this city and about growing up in a complex racial situation that you did?
Look, I love the city. I do. And New Orleans is home and will always be home. I mean, I left New Orleans. So I grew up in New Orleans. I went to college in New York. And then I came back and was a reporter here for 6 years, but I haven't lived here since 1984, 83, when I moved to Chicago. It's complicated. First off, it's not just my decision. I have a kid who's grown up in Los Angeles, a wife who's from New York and has spent a long time in each of those cities. New Orleans is the place that feels most like home to me. But I think I'm so busy putting off that decision about where I'm going to live, which is a way of pretending I'm not going to have to retire, that I get to punt. And plus, the clock is done.
Well, Jim Amos and I will come at you. But Dean, thank you. You're a true hero in this city. Thank you so much.
Thank you.